Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in Blois. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. The year was 1901, and Blois was in the grip of a quiet, uneasy spring. The city, with its steep lanes and gray riverbanks, carried an air of solemn beauty that hid a growing anxiety among its people. The murder of Marguerite Lefevre would come to mark this season as one of whispers and unanswered questions. Marguerite, 26, was known in the Saint-Lô quarter as a teacher of children and a collector of pressed flowers. Her lodging stood near the Rue du Pont-Neuf, where the Loire's mist rose like the breath of the city itself. Nothing in her manner suggested danger or scandal. She was, by all surviving accounts, reserved and kindly, with that peculiar melancholy of the era's unmarried women. Her landlord, Monsieur Corbin, later recalled that she often wrote by candlelight well past midnight, as if answering letters no one had sent. On the morning of April 3rd, she was found missing. The door to her room was locked from the inside, and yet she was gone. The police of Blois, led by Commissaire Duret, forced entry. They found her writing desk overturned, the ink dried mid-stroke upon an unfinished line. The man in the coat waits by. Nothing followed. The window latch was unbroken, but the curtain bore a smear of soil, and on the floor lay a small iron key that fit no lock in the house. Blois had seen tragedy before: fires, floods, cholera, but this case struck differently. It echoed old fears from the rural parishes, where strange disappearances were once blamed on vagabonds or darker things. In the weeks that followed, newspapers linked the case to the region's older archives, citing an 1898 disappearance of a housemaid in nearby Vendôme. The Journal de Loir-et-Cher quoted an unnamed constable saying, "The Lefevre matter bears the same handwriting of silence." At first, the authorities suspected flight, a secret lover perhaps. But the river yielded nothing, and none of Marguerite's belongings were missing, except a locket containing a faded portrait of her late father. When the case reached the prefecture, a single name surfaced in whispers: Etienne Rousseau, a railway clerk who had lodged briefly in Blois 2 winters prior. He was said to have taken an interest in Marguerite, sending her letters written in the ornate, fevered language of devotion. Yet no letter was found in her room, nor any trace of his presence in the city registers after 1899. The Blois archives, now partially preserved in the Bibliothèque Abbé Grégoire, mention the city as a place where quiet respectability and hidden tragedies often coexisted. Among them, this story stood apart, for it bore no resolution, only fragments, reports, testimonies, and one haunting note in the parish death register of St. Nicolas that read simply, "She went out and did not return." That line, written in the hand of Abbé Lenoir, remains the final verified entry of Marguerite Lefevre's life. Her absence was recorded, but her end was never confirmed. It would be the beginning of years of speculation, false sightings, and a slow unraveling of the calm facade that Blois kept so carefully. By late April of 1901, the atmosphere in Blois had grown strained. Newspapers no longer printed daily updates, but the case was whispered everywhere, in cafes, in the market, even in church pews. Some residents spoke of seeing a veiled woman walking near the embankment after dusk. Others claimed the constables searched the wrong side of the river. In Commissaire Duret's later memorandum, he noted how speculation became a contagion more persistent than grief. The constables combed through parish records, questioned the laundress who washed Marguerite's clothes, even sent inquiries to Orléans, yet each report led to the same conclusion: she had simply vanished. The prefecture ordered the files closed, but Duret refused. He spent his evenings at the small office on Rue des Trois Clés, sorting through letters, cross-checking testimonies, and returning again and again to the unexplained key found in her room. No lock in the building or nearby fitted. Some thought it belonged to the church vestry, others to a trunk once owned by the Lefevre family. But when Duret consulted Father Lenoir, the old priest shook his head and said quietly, Some keys opened places we ought not to revisit. Rumors began to link the affair to a house 2 streets from Marguerite's, where the widow Bertine had kept lodgers until a fire gutted it in 1897, an incident still recorded in the municipal logs of Blois. Among those lost possessions was said to be a trunk sealed with a peculiar iron lock. Duret, determined, tracked down Bertine's surviving nephew in Tours, a man named Armand Dufour. His testimony, preserved in fragmentary notes, described a tenant named Rousseau, tall, withdrawn, forever smelling of camphor, who left abruptly, owing 2 months' rent. He took nothing but a satchel, Dufour recalled, and a small metal box, which he held like scripture. It was the first and only mention of Rousseau's belongings, and the timing matched the year of Marguerite's first teaching post. Duret requested access to the remnants of the burned house. There, beneath collapsed beams and weeds, workers uncovered fragments of scorched letters and a rosary blackened by soot. One scrap, half legible, bore the name Lefevre, followed by the words, "She will not forget me." This discovery revived public interest and unearthed older superstitions, linking Rousseau's name to whispers of the Watcher, a folk belief once common in the Loire region. The Gazette de Blois even invoked the city's own past tragedies, recalling the 1896 floods and the tales that followed, stories found in the same archives where the history of Blois itself is documented. Duret, however, was not a man for legends. He believed in evidence, and evidence led him deeper into inconsistencies, receipts that appeared twice under different names, a witness who swore Marguerite had attended Easter Mass days after her supposed disappearance. The constable's margin note beside that testimony reads simply, "She cannot be in 2 places at once." As weeks turned to months, the town settled back into uneasy normalcy, though children were warned not to stray near the abandoned houses along the riverfront. Each night, the Loire wind carried faint creaks of shutters, which the locals said sounded like a door trying to open with the wrong key. Summer crept into Blois that year with a strange stillness. The days were bright but unnervingly quiet, and the locals began to avoid Rue du Pont-Neuf altogether. Among the records preserved at the prefecture is a report dated July 9, 1901, in which Commissaire Duret describes a visit to Marguerite's abandoned room. He noted the persistence of a faint lavender scent, the kind once sold in small corked bottles at the chemist near Saint-Lomeur. The desk remained where it had fallen, and the iron key still sat in evidence, tagged and unsolved. Duret's assistant, Officer Blanchet, recorded that when they opened the small drawer beneath the writing slope, they found a pressed violet sealed between 2 pages of a devotional book. The flower crumbled upon contact, releasing an almost imperceptible dust that left a violet mark on Duret's cuff. That trivial detail would appear again in later correspondence, where he wrote, "It is as if she left a trace finer than ash, yet impossible to wash away." Meanwhile, the prefecture received a letter from the constabulary in Tours reporting that a man matching Rousseau's description had been seen boarding a freight train toward Angers. But when questioned, the station clerk swore he recognized no such passenger. The discrepancy irritated Duret. He revisited the archives of Blois, those same municipal volumes referenced in the records of the city's earlier history, searching for any mention of a Rousseau born within the department. No birth entry matched. The surname appeared twice in the tax rolls, but under unrelated tradesmen. It was as though the man had existed only in rumor. By late August, Duret had come to suspect forgery in the parish documentation. Marguerite's name, he observed, appeared twice in the attendance ledgers of St. Nicholas School during the week of her disappearance, written in 2 distinct hands. The handwriting expert from Orléans identified one as authentic, the other as imitated. He could not say by whom. A torn fragment of a class list, later found in a drawer, contained a faint penciled note. "He waits by the east wall." The same phrasing echoed the unfinished line from her final letter. Duret revisited the riverside quarter that evening, describing in his diary how the stone facades seemed to absorb the sunset into their cracks. He interviewed a cooper named Henri Valette, who claimed that, on the night of April 2nd, he saw a tall figure standing motionless beside the eastern wall of the church. Valette described him as not moving for a long time, only his hat brim turning when the bell struck. He assumed it was a beggar, until the figure vanished between the chime and the echo. Duray's report ends with the note, "There are moments when absence feels heavier than presence." As autumn neared, the townspeople began to speak less of the case, yet some said the woman's scent still drifted near the Pont Neuf stairs at dusk, lavender faint and out of place among the damp stones. September brought storms to Blois, brief, violent bursts of rain that left the streets shining like polished slate. The river swelled, and the fog returned, heavier than before. It was during this time that Commissaire Duray made his most curious discovery. In a bundle of parish documents retrieved from the rectory archives, he found a ledger belonging to the late Abbé Lenoir, the same priest who had recorded Marguerite's disappearance. The ledger contained routine notes, baptisms, funerals, parish donations, until one entry dated March 31st, 1901, caught his eye. It read, "A stranger attended evening mass, seated in the last pew by the pillar of St. Roch. He did not kneel." No description followed, only a small cross drawn beside the line, as though to mark uncertainty. Duray cross-referenced the date and found that Marguerite had indeed been present at that same Mass, teaching catechism earlier that day. The connection, if any, remained speculative, yet the timing was precise. When Duray revisited the church, he noted the east wall, its cold stone surface pitted with age, its corner shaded even in daylight. It matched Valette's description perfectly. Duray observed the spot where a man might hide, half concealed from the street, but able to watch the entrance. He lingered there as the bells tolled 6, writing later, "It is easy to imagine eyes in that shadow." His fascination with the case deepened to the point of obsession. Blach, his assistant, confided in a later statement that the commissaire had begun sketching floor plans of the neighborhood from memory, tracing routes that converged always upon the same point, the eastern wall. The Blois archives, which once recorded the city's architectural restorations, show that this quarter had been largely unchanged since 1870. Even the drain gratings bore the same manufacturer's stamp. Somewhere within that permanence, Duray believed, lay the clue to Marguerite's fate. He began re-interviewing witnesses, though by now their stories had blurred. Valette recanted parts of his testimony, saying perhaps the figure he saw was only a shadow cast by a passing cart. Others recalled seeing lights near the river that night, faint lanterns bobbing in the mist. In one report, a laundress described hearing a knock beneath the boards of the pontoon she used to rinse linens. She had dismissed it as driftwood, yet her account coincided exactly with the hour when Duray believed Marguerite disappeared. The commissaire wrote in his margin, "If she was taken, it was not by water, but through something built for passage." The prefect dismissed the theory as conjecture, yet Duray's persistence began to unsettle even his superiors. By October, his health had declined. He was seen coughing into a handkerchief darkened with ink and smoke. He continued nonetheless, writing that the case had become a study of the unseen geography of this city, its walls remembering what men forget. Blois, once tranquil, had become for him a map of echoes. By early November 1901, the mist over the Loire had thickened so much that even the bells of Saint Nicolas sounded muffled. Duray spent those weeks in archives and cellars, tracing every rumor that could bind Marguerite Lefevre's name to something tangible. He visited the municipal records room in Blois, where humidity curled the pages of ledgers like old leaves. It was there he stumbled upon a brief mention in an 1899 census roll, a lodging on Rue Saint-Lomère, listed under Monsieur Rousseau, railway clerk, temporary. The entry had been struck through in red ink, annotated, moved, unconfirmed. That same handwriting matched a clerk later dismissed for falsifying signatures on freight permits. Duret realized this Rousseau may have lived in several identities, a pattern fitting the regional reports of transient clerks across the Loire Valley between 1896 and 1900. He noted it beside the name Lefevre, as if pairing two vanished signatures. In mid-November, another clue emerged. A fisherman named Jules Montfort claimed that after one storm, debris washed up beneath the bridge included a small trunk with an iron lock, the kind the constables once described. The trunk, water-swollen and rusted, contained scraps of lace, a child's book, and a folded sheet of paper so deteriorated that words had fused into stains. The only phrase legible under lantern light was, "It follows where I go." The handwriting, Duret believed, was not Marguerite's. The prefect ordered the items sealed, labeling them miscellaneous, but the commissaire continued privately, corresponding with a librarian at the Bibliothèque Abbé Grégoire, who was compiling a study on the town's history, Blois, its architecture, and forgotten tragedies. Duret sent him extracts from parish journals to compare ink composition, hoping to prove the same pen had written both Marguerite's unfinished note and the trunk fragment. The results were inconclusive. The ink was local, the same ferric gall mixture used in schools across Loire-et-Cher. But the librarian's reply included a curious remark. In certain humidity, such ink fades faster when exposed to lavender oil. Duret paused on that sentence. The scent in her room returned vividly to his mind. He revisited the apartment, now leased to a new tenant who complained of a faint perfume that returns after rain. On the sill, behind a loosened board, Duret found a folded scrap of parchment bearing only the initials M.L. and a small rust-colored smudge that might have been dried wax or something darker. He logged it without comment, but his diary from that night contains one line. She left messages that dissolve when read. Rumors spread that Duret had begun hearing knocks in the office at odd hours. His assistant Blanchet swore to it, describing 3 soft raps that seemed to come from beneath the floorboards, though no cellar lay below. The case file expanded by pages, yet offered no conclusion. The prefecture considered reassigning Duret to Tours for his health, but winter kept him there, pacing the streets of Blois, convinced the truth still waited behind one of its damp, echoing walls. December arrived, with frost thick along the riverbank, and the alleys of Blois turned to stone beneath the cold. Duret's reports from that month grew shorter, more fevered in style, as though his handwriting chased after his thoughts before they slipped away. On the 12th, he noted that the eastern wall of St. Nicolas Church, the one described by witnesses, showed a faint indentation behind a cracked section of plaster. He arranged for masons to remove the outer layer, revealing a narrow recess sealed with bricks and mortar long discolored. Inside lay nothing but a coil of iron wire and a child's hair ribbon bleached by time, yet Duret kept the objects as if they were relics. Blanchet recorded his superior's words that day. The city hides its memory like bones beneath a floor. By midwinter, the commissaire no longer sent his findings to the prefecture, but to himself, addressing envelopes marked only Rue du Pont Neuf, Room 3, though the room had long since been rented to another. In January of 1902, a clerk sorting old mail found those letters unopened, stacked neatly in a drawer. They contained sketches, measurements of streets, notes on sound reflections, maps of the church shadow at different hours, each annotated with a single recurring phrase, "He is still by the wall." The Blois archives later catalogued them as evidence of obsession, yet there were those who insisted Duret had come close to uncovering something tangible. The mason who helped open the wall told his grandson decades later that the stone within smelled of damp iron and candle wax, like a sealed vault. No official record of any vault exists, but the municipal plans of 1857 show a disused crypt beneath the east transept, walled after subsidence and forgotten thereafter. This detail appears again in a surviving note from Duret's assistant. He asked if it was possible someone might walk below the church unseen. Round this time, Father Renaud, Lenoir's successor, reported nocturnal sounds in the sacristy, describing soft metallic touches as of something tapping faintly at stone. He dismissed it as expansion from the frost, though parishioners began to avoid evening prayers. Durette grew visibly ill, pale from insomnia, his eyes ringed with ink stains where he rubbed his brow with the same hand that held his pen. His last signed entry in the case file reads, "The soil breathes when the river sleeps." By February, he vanished from official duty. No resignation was filed, only a notice stating, "Absence unexplained." Years later, an inventory of his belongings listed one sealed envelope containing a faded violet pressed between blotter paper, its scent preserved against all decay. The archivist who handled it described the aroma as unnervingly fresh, as though the flower had been placed there yesterday. Her report closes with the notation, "Document retained for study, provenance uncertain." Among those papers, the initials ML appeared one final time, drawn faintly in the margin like a closing whisper. Spring of 1902 returned quietly to Blois, but those who remembered the case said the air along the Pont Neuf felt heavier, the sound of the Loire more muted than before. The disappearance of Commissaire Duret unsettled even his detractors. The prefecture dispatched 2 men to his quarters, but found only dust and a stack of blank report sheets, weighted by the same iron key once recovered from Marguerite Lefevre's room. The press gave the matter little space, calling it a lapse in service. Yet the townspeople whispered that he had followed his own clues into the dark recesses beneath Saint Nicolas, never to return. A year later, in 1903, construction workers restoring drainage near the church unearthed a sealed wooden crate within a collapsed trench. Inside were scraps of uniform fabric, buttons marked with the departmental insignia, and a small notebook warped by moisture. The pages, though blurred, contained recognizable words: river, wall, east, and once again the initials, ML. Duret's handwriting was identified, but no remains were found. The prefect ordered the discovery sealed and the contents stored among miscellaneous municipal property, where they remained until the archive fire of 1912 destroyed them. The Gazette de Blois printed a brief memorial, ending with a line that many found haunting: "The city keeps its silence better than its dead." In later correspondence preserved at the Bibliothèque Abbé Grégoire, the same institution whose collection includes the Chronicles of Blois, one librarian remarked that each investigator who handled the Lefevre file seemed to develop insomnia and recurring dreams of running water beneath stone. When questioned, the clerks laughed it off, calling it the fatigue of ink fumes, yet one clerk, Mademoiselle Fournier, resigned after claiming she heard the turning of a key where none existed. By 1905, the Lefevre affair had passed into local legend. The younger generation spoke of it only as the lavender case. Children dared one another to leave flowers on the church steps at dusk, a ritual said to bring faint footsteps behind them for 3 paces only. Most adults dismissed it, but the sacristan swore that every spring a single pressed violet appeared on the sill of the eastern window, despite his efforts to keep it closed. Even after the building's restoration, when new plaster covered the cracks Duret once traced, visitors said the patch discolored faster than the rest of the wall, as if dampened from within. In 1906, Professor Armand Lescaut of the medical faculty in Orléans reviewed the surviving testimony, concluding that both Marguerite and Duret likely succumbed to exhaustion and the confusions of isolation, dismissing any notion of foul play. Yet he admitted the coincidence of the iron key and the missing crypt troubled him, writing, "Facts end where the floor begins." The statement would later appear in his papers underlined twice. A local newspaper printed it beside a brief notice, recalling Blois' long history of strange silences, from vanished traders in 1882 to the unclaimed letters found after the 1896 floods, all, it seemed, sharing that same quiet gravity that time could not wash away. By 1907, the Lefevre case had faded from official memory, but among the townspeople of Blois it endured like an echo muffled by dust. The house where Marguerite once lived stood empty. Tenants complained of drafts, of ink bottles overturning themselves, of a scent that lingered no matter how many times the floors were scrubbed. The landlord, Monsieur Corbin, finally shuttered it, scrawling "closed for renovation" on a board that hung for nearly a decade without change. Across the river, a new constable, Henri Poiret, began assembling forgotten files, hoping to modernize the record system. He stumbled upon a packet labeled Non Résolu, 1901. Inside were yellowed testimonies, fragments of Duré's sketches, and a single photograph of the church wall, its corner faintly lit by morning sun. Poiret wrote in his report, "No sign of vault or recess, only discoloration where moisture seeps." Yet one note caught his attention, a line in Duré's hand nearly erased by damp. "Light from east window at dawn reveals the hollow." The constable returned at sunrise and stood facing that wall. As the light shifted, he noticed a difference in texture. 2 stones, slightly recessed, their mortar of a darker hue. He knocked softly. The sound returned hollow. He ordered the area tested for voids, but the priest refused excavation, citing the sanctity of the foundation. The matter ended there, but Poiret confided in his personal diary that he dreamt that night of footsteps pacing within stone, stopping whenever he listened too closely. In that same year, rumors spread that a traveling scholar researching the folklore of the Loire had mentioned the Lefevre disappearance while referencing Blois in his lectures. He cited it alongside other provincial mysteries, unexplained vanishings, letters found in wells, voices in sealed rooms. The city's chroniclers noted that such tales, while exaggerated, often preserved a gisou, reign of real history. The Wikipedia reference to Blois, the city itself, would in later decades serve scholars tracing these forgotten threads through municipal archives and parish accounts, their tone calm but edged with unease. Poiret's later letters to Orléans mention consulting those same local histories, hoping to compare handwriting samples between Duré's notes and marginalia found in another case file from 1898. The resemblance was unsettling, as though one unseen hand had annotated both documents nearly 3 years apart. When Poiret died in 1909, his effects included the photo of the church wall and the iron key, which he had taken from evidence for study. It remained in his family until 1932, when his nephew donated it to the Museum of Loire et Cher. The curator described it as ordinary, unnumbered, bearing traces of ash or soot. He placed it in a glass case labeled simply "Key, origin uncertain." Visitors reported nothing unusual, except that condensation sometimes appeared on the inside of the case during cold months. The attendant would wipe it away, but by morning it always returned in the faint outline of what looked like an initial, an M, though some said it was a crooked L, joined like a signature the city itself had yet to finish writing. After Poiret's death, the official paper trail thinned, but private letters kept the case breathing beneath the dust of Blois. In 1910, a postmaster named Louis Merle wrote to the prefecture describing an envelope that arrived without address, its ink dissolved into pale smudges. He opened it only to find a pressed violet inside and a folded slip bearing the words, "He waits by the wall." Merle sealed it again and forwarded it to Orléans, where it was filed under anonymous correspondence. The note vanished before cataloging was complete. Those who handled it recalled the faint perfume of lavender, identical to the scent once reported in Marguerite Lefevre's apartment. In March of that same year, restoration began on the eastern section of Saint-Nicolas Church. A crew removing damaged stone claimed to find an irregular cavity filled with compacted dust and fragments of paper. When touched, the fragments dissolved. The foreman wrote to the diocese suggesting it might have been a hidden niche for devotional texts, but his apprentice swore one shred bore a sketch of a woman's face, drawn in the fluid, narrow hand common to schoolteachers. The drawing was discarded, Yet that single remark reignited interest in the case among younger archivists who grew up hearing their parents' tales of the lavender schoolmistress. One such archivist, Lucien Martel, undertook a quiet comparison between the handwriting on a preserved parish roll and surviving notes by Duret, noting uncanny similarities in the slant and spacing. He never published his findings, merely writing to a colleague that two seekers looked for the same wall. By the eve of 1911, Blois again carried the subdued energy that precedes a storm. The Loire was low, its stones glistening beneath thin water, and fishermen spoke of hearing faint knocking from beneath the embankment at night. They joked of ghosts, but one, old Alain Joubert, refused to fish near the church bend after sunset, muttering, "Something taps to be let in." The remark appeared in a local column, printed without comment beside weather reports and municipal news. In the Bibliothèque Abbé Grégoire, where the history of Blois and its vanished citizens intertwined, the Lefevre file grew fragile with age. Margins yellowed, ink faint as breath, yet the initials ML remained darker than the rest, as though resistant to time. A curator in 1912 noted that the paper seemed slightly warm to the touch, an effect attributed to chemical residue from old preservation methods. That same year, a fire consumed part of the archive room, sparing only a handful of documents stacked within a metal drawer. Among them was the entry, Blois, disappearance 1901, its corner singed, but legible. The saved record carried the final words of Commissaire Duret, copied from his notebook. "The soil breathes when the river sleeps." After that, the municipal catalogue marked the case as perdu, lost, and yet every decade since, someone claims to see a violet pressed between the stones of the church wall each spring morning before the sun reaches it, only to vanish as the bells of Saint Nicolas begin to ring. When the century turned its first quiet decade and war had not yet arrived, Blois seemed to sink into a sleep unbroken except by the bells of Saint Nicolas. The Lefevre affair had no longer a line in any official ledger, but its texture remained everywhere. The smell of lavender near the Pont Neuf, the habit of shopkeepers to lock doors at dusk. The older residents said the city itself remembered even when its people tried to forget. In 1913, a visiting historian named Madame Cécile Garnier arrived from Tours to study the architectural evolution of Blois. She spent her mornings copying notes from the same Bibliothèque Abbé Grégoire that preserved Duret's fragments. Her diary, later found among her estate papers, described a morning when she paused at the eastern wall of Saint Nicolas. "A peculiar cold seems to drift from the stone," she wrote, "not wind exactly, but an exhalation." She asked the sexton about it, and was told the story of Marguerite Lefevre in careful half-sentences. He ended by saying, "The wall breathes, best not to listen too close." Garnier, being rational, laughed it off, yet her next entry spoke of hearing footsteps that kept pace with her along the narrow lane and stopped when she stopped. She concluded it must be the echo one hears in the tight alleys of Blois, the same phenomenon mentioned in the city's own history, those acoustic tricks that make sound linger longer between stone facades. The reference to Blois as a city of echoes appears even in the Modern Encyclopedia article about its architecture, a reminder of how deeply such sensations tie to place. In late autumn that year, Garnier submitted her research to the Orléans faculty and left the city. 2 months later, her brother received a parcel from Blois containing her field notebook and a single pressed violet between the last pages. The sender's name had been scraped away. Through the following winter, the locals claimed that the east wall stones never froze even in the hardest frost, remaining slick as if touched by water. A watchman assigned to the church reported faint light behind the window long after the candles were extinguished. When questioned, Father Renaud dismissed it as reflection from the river, but he admitted privately to a visiting canon that it shines too steady to be reflection. By 1914, the first tremors of war shifted attention elsewhere, yet those who fled Blois during the early mobilizations told of strange comforts. that in the train's rattle they sometimes heard the same rhythm as the old bells, and in the steam's scent a trace of lavender. The association was unconscious, perhaps, but enduring. The city's calm returned after the armistice, leaving the church untouched, the walls sealed again with new plaster. A caretaker wrote that when he mixed the mortar, the smell of iron rose strong enough to make him step back. The trowel left streaks dark as ink that dried lighter only days later. No inscription remained, only a faint groove where initials might once have been. By 1916, as soldiers passed through Blois on their way to the front, the city's older mysteries became quiet folklore told in candlelit kitchens. The Lefevre case was spoken of not as crime but as omen. Women pressed violets in letters to their husbands, believing it might bring them home safely. Among those temporary billets was Sergeant Pierre Clément, who later recorded in his war journal that the locals warned him not to lean against the east wall of Saint-Nicolas because it listens. He laughed, noting how superstition clung to small towns, yet one night, while stationed near the river bridge, he claimed to hear a soft rhythmic tapping echoing from the church direction, steady as Morse, but unintelligible. His note ends. It went on for 12 beats after the bell. When Clément was killed near Reims 2 years later, his belongings were returned to his widow. Among them lay a photograph of Blois, the wall faintly visible behind a haze that some mistook for fog. In 1919, as France counted its losses, archivists resumed the task of restoring local records lost to fire. They opened drawers untouched since before the war, discovering among them the surviving fragments of Duret's notebook, now brittle and half erased. One young archivist, Marthe Delaunay, described in her log how touching the pages left a gray residue on her fingers, smelling faintly of candle smoke and lavender. She wrote that evening, "It feels indecent to handle grief that still breathes." At the Bibliothèque Abbé Grégoire, where the records of Blois' past are maintained, a new exhibit showcased the city's 19th-century evolution, railways, floods, restorations, yet one caption beside a photograph of Saint-Nicolas included a curious line, "Site of unexplained disappearance 1901. Visitors asked about it, and the curator simply said, "A legend of our town." The image showed the church bright in daylight, no shadow, where the east wall stood. Yet the photographer later confessed that, when developing the plate, a faint outline appeared near the corner, a silhouette that did not match any passerby from the negative sequence. He dismissed it as chemical error, but kept the plate in a drawer at home where his daughter found it years later and insisted the figure resembled a woman holding a folded paper. The story never reached print, existing only in notes and retellings through Blois families who enjoyed quiet horrors after supper. The Municipal Bulletin of 1920 mentioned the name Lefevre once more, briefly, in connection with a property sale, Marguerite's former apartment, purchased by a notary who intended to demolish it. He died of influenza before the work began. The building remained intact until the 1930s, its windows boarded, ivy curling over the lintels like green handwriting reclaiming the stone. When the boards were removed decades later, neighbors said the scent within was sweet, dry, and unmistakably floral, though no source could be found. It dissipated only after the shutters were opened to full light. By 1922, the house on Rue du Pont-Neuf stood empty again, its facade flaking into layers that showed older paint beneath like sediment from each tenant's brief stay. The municipal council debated its demolition, but deferred for lack of funds. The locals called it La Maison Close au Parfum, the perfumed closed house, and avoided walking past after sundown. A journalist from Orléans, André Valmy, arrived that spring to gather materials for an article on the forgotten cases of Loire et Cher. He found few who would speak directly about Marguerite Lefevre. Most gestured toward the river or the church and changed the subject. Valmy's notebook, discovered later among his personal effects, records a detail omitted from his published piece, that he felt a draft within the sealed house, though every window had been nailed shut. He described it as the slow inhalation of a sleeper. When he examined the walls by lantern light, he found faint traces of writing obscured by mildew. letters resembling M and L carved shallowly into the plaster. He took a rubbing, which he sent to the Historical Society in Tours. Their archivist noted the similarity to marks recorded in earlier parish renovations, the same wall at Saint Nicolas where Duret once searched. The repetition of those initials across decades unsettled even the rational minds who studied them, as though some hand insisted on rewriting its absence. Valmy visited the Bibliothèque Abbé Grégoire to verify records and mentioned in correspondence that the staff refused to bring out the Lefevre dossier after dark. He finally viewed it at noon under open shutters, describing the ink as paler than bone dust. Among the fragments he noticed one annotation underlined twice: See Blois, 1898 ledger for first key. He traced that reference to an earlier case of disappearance. A seamstress named Elise Marin reported missing after attending Mass in the Aime church 3 years before Marguerite. The records were brief, a single sheet, but contained a witness remarking that a tall man waited by the east wall. Valmy realized this echoed Duret's notes precisely. He wrote, "The pattern repeats, year, wall, woman." He spent one final night in Blois before returning home. His hotel keeper later testified that the journalist rose at 4, saying he wished to see the dawn light on the church facade. He never returned for breakfast. The Orléans paper received no article that week, and his notebook, mailed from Blois days later, contained only the sentence. He leaned closer to the stone, and it breathed. Authorities found his luggage still in the hotel room, undisturbed, and the station clerk swore no passenger by that name boarded a train. Valmy's disappearance joined the quiet pile of unresolved provincial mysteries that the city filed away with mechanical politeness. The smell of lavender once again noted by those who searched his room, faint but undeniable, like a breath drawn in and never released. Summer 1924 came to Blois with a heat so dry the cobblestone shimmered like glass, and for the first time in decades, the eastern wall of Saint Nicolas showed cracks thin as veins through its new plaster. The masons who inspected them said it was ordinary expansion, but the parish accountant noted a curious thing. The mortar inside the cracks smelled faintly floral when wetted. He wrote this in his ledger without explanation, signing simply, J.D. When renovations began again that August, workers found embedded behind a loosened stone a small metal disc the size of a coin, etched faintly with 2 letters intertwined, M and L. The find was placed in the presbytery safe, where it soon vanished. A rumor spread that one apprentice had taken it home, but his widow swore he returned it to the wall itself, slipping it into the gap and sealing it again with quick-drying plaster. No one inspected his work. The stone hardened smooth within hours. The next month, the Loire rose unexpectedly after a sudden storm, flooding the lower quarter and drowning the basements along Rue du Pont-Neuf. When the water receded, residents reported the same persistent scent of lavender mixed with river silt. A chemist from Orléans sampled the residue, concluding it contained trace amounts of iron oxide and organic oil, perhaps from old perfume stores. Still, the parish bulletin published a small caution urging citizens to keep distance from damaged walls until inspected. The note was unsigned, yet printed in the same column once used for obituaries. During that period, a historian from Blois University, Marcel Ravier, resumed research on provincial disappearances between 1890 and 1905. His cross-index led him inevitably to the Lefevre case and to Duret's lost notebook, already fragmentary. Ravier visited the Bibliothèque Abbé Grégoire, where the chronicled history of Blois itself, streets, fires, restorations, remediation, aimed the city's anchor of fact. He quoted passages from those volumes in his later essay, describing Blois as a town where silence has the texture of cloth. While consulting Duret's surviving sketches, Ravier noticed faint impressions beneath the ink, as though another sheet had once lain over the page. He used graphite to reveal the indentation. It outlined a key with a broken stem, and beside it, a single line, "The soil breathes." He included this detail in his 1925 lecture on the psychology of investigators, suggesting Duré's mind projected patterns onto the city's landscape, creating an illusion of pursuit. Students applauded the logic, but afterward, an elderly parish clerk approached him to say the commissaire had been closer than he thought. Ravier dismissed the remark until weeks later, when he returned to Saint-Nicolas to take photographs of the restoration. The negatives developed clearly except one, the frame of the east wall, which showed a blurred vertical shadow just at the corner, darker than any neighboring tone. He enlarged it and discovered faint contours that could have been fabric folds or ribs of stone. No one could say for certain. He labeled it exposure flaw. That winter, his assistant reported hearing soft knocking from the archive cupboard where the glass plate was stored, though it ceased whenever he touched the handle. By 1926, Ravier's photograph had become a quiet curiosity among Blois scholars, passed hand-to-hand in classrooms as an example of chemical imperfection. Yet each who held it claimed to smell faint lavender for a heartbeat before the odor vanished. The assistant who had heard the knocking left the university soon after, telling colleagues he no longer slept soundly. He kept dreaming of wet stone corridors and a pale figure whose hands were folded as if in prayer, but whose eyes were open. Among the notes he left behind was a traced outline of that shadow from the plate with the letters M and L penciled beneath, as if initials could tame a shape. By autumn, Ravier returned to his research, determined to strip the legend of its mystique. He reread every remaining file from the Bibliothèque Abbé Grégoire, where the chronicles of Blois recorded not only civic events, but personal notations of its archivists. In one 1902 margin, he found Duré's handwriting again, the same firm slope, beside a list of municipal expenditures. It read, "East wall repairs, unnecessary." The discovery unsettled him, proving Duré had access to documents long before they were officially catalogued. Ravier wondered if the commissaire had arranged the repairs himself to conceal something. He traced the budget entry to a contractor's family still living near the bridge. The eldest son, then in his 60s, remembered his father speaking of a room within a wall already closed when we arrived. He described how they were told to fill the hollow completely, so no mouse could breathe. The phrase echoed Duré's own note, "The soil breathes," and Ravier began to suspect the wording was not poetic but literal, a clue to a cavity, a vault, or perhaps a forgotten crypt linked to the 1857 plans still stored in the municipal basement. When he requested those blueprints, the clerk found the folio missing, its label torn awousou. The restoration of 1931 was meant to modernize the facade of Saint-Nicolas, yet workers whispered that the mortar never quite dried on the east wall and the limewash kept darkening overnight. They repainted it 3 times before the overseer ordered the crew to move on, claiming damp air from the river was to blame. Among them was an apprentice named René Lomé, who decades later told his granddaughter that while mixing plaster at dawn, he saw a reflection in the wall, like someone standing inside looking out. He dropped his trowel and refused to work that section again. The anecdote remained a family story, unrecorded, until she mentioned it to a Blois historian who recognized its similarity to earlier witness accounts preserved in the Bibliothèque Abbé Grégoire, where the chronicles of Blois still anchored the region's memory. That same year, a maintenance survey found an uneven temperature reading on the inner surface of the east wall, 3 degrees warmer than the rest of the church. The inspector noted the anomaly, but offered no theory. In 1932, an archivist reviewing the lost cases of Loire-et-Cher included Marguerite Lefevre's name in a pamphlet titled Inexplicable Absences. He wrote that every 20 to 30 years the case resurfaced, like air trapped beneath stone. The pamphlet cited Duré's vanished notebook and Ravier's last notes, but concluded with the phrase, "No further evidence exists, only recurrence." 2 months later, the archivist's assistant reported that someone had broken into the document room. Nothing was stolen except a small metal disc previously stored with other unidentified artifacts labeled ML. No suspect was ever identified. The theft revived curiosity, drawing young students to the church as if to test the legend themselves. Some swore the wall resonated faintly when tapped. Others claimed they heard water behind it, though the ground beneath had long dried. A police notice posted on the gate warned against damaging church property. Yet every spring, faint chalk initials reappeared near the lower stones, washed away by the caretakers, only to return again after rainfall. By 1934, the story had become part of Blois' identity. Shopkeepers sold postcards showing the church with captions like "Le mystère du mur est." Tourists treated it as harmless folklore, but older citizens refused to enter the nave after dusk. The organist, a pragmatic man, confessed privately that some evenings the final note of his practice sustained several seconds longer than physics allowed, a tremor rising from beneath the pedals as though the floor exhaled. The war clouds gathering over Europe soon pushed all such tales aside, yet the parish records from those years show maintenance reports noting persistent moisture, odor of herbs, and once the phrase "small clicking as of metal." Each line signed and countersigned, each explanation practical, none satisfactory. The wall, smooth and pale, watched another decade turn while the city above it changed, carrying the same unease that every new coat of plaster failed to conceal. When war returned to France in 1940, Blois became a way station for refugees fleeing south. The Church of Saint Nicolas opened its doors as shelter. Families slept along the nave, and children played beside the very wall whose history the elders avoided speaking of. One nurse, Sister Elodie, later wrote in her diary that at night the air near that corner grew warmer and smelled faintly of flowers crushed under wet stone. She blamed fatigue until the same scent drifted through even when the doors were flung open for ventilation. Her entry, preserved in a convent ledger, ends, "Someone stands behind the wall when prayers cease." During the occupation, a German engineer quartered in the sacristy ordered a structural inspection, suspecting a hidden passage useful for storage. The report concluded there was none, yet the inspector added a curious note. "East wall, magnetic anomaly, minor." He sealed the paper with official wax and filed it with others under nicked relevant. The local priest later recovered the folder after liberation and found the page missing. In 1946, reconstruction funds brought masons again. They replaced the cracked paving outside the apse and discovered beneath one slab a narrow cavity filled with silt and a rusted hinge of unknown origin. The foreman kept it, cleaning off the corrosion, until the metal revealed faint engraved lines resembling two letters intertwined. M and L. The object was sent to the small museum that already displayed the mysterious key donated years earlier. The curator remarked they seemed made by the same hand. The museum's record of Blois, so often cited by researchers tracing the city's material past, listed both artifacts as donor anonymous. The exhibit drew quiet attention from post-war travelers interested in regional folklore. Some took photographs, though many plates developed with an unintended haze near the edges, as if the lens had caught mist indoors. A technician noted that the exposure time had been correct, yet a shadow halo persisted no matter how he adjusted chemicals. In 1948, a university team from Orléans visited to document the relics. They reported no paranormal features, yet one student fainted during the examination, claiming to hear knocking beneath the floorboards of the gallery when no one else did. Their supervisor dismissed it as nerves, but mentioned the detail in his notes for completeness. The key was later moved to storage after oxidation worsened. Its tag still read simply, Blois, 1901. That winter, the Loire froze, locking the river in silence. The townspeople said it was the first season in memory when no fog rose to veil the church. But those who passed by claimed the plaster of the east wall looked damp, though the air was dry. Sister Elodie, old now, visited once more and wrote a final note before her death. The scent has grown faint. Perhaps she rests at last. The line below, in another hand added, "Or perhaps the wall has learned to breathe without her." In the 1950s, Blois began to rebuild its reputation as a quiet provincial city. Tourists came for its chateau, not its absences. Yet every local guidebook retained a single page titled Le Mur du Silence, the Wall of Silence, recounting in softened tones the story of Marguerite Lefevre and Commissaire Duret. The municipal council even considered repainting Saint-Nicolas entirely to erase the discoloration, but the architects advised against it, claiming the lime beneath was too old and might crumble. The decision left that single section of wall slightly darker than the rest, a vertical stripe like a scar. On summer evenings, the tour groups would pause there. The guides repeated the facts, omitting the later rumors, though children still pressed flowers into the cracks for luck. In 1954, a graduate researcher named Alain Bourdet requested access to the museum's storage to study early 20th century metallurgy. He examined the key and hinge associated with the case, noting both bore traces of calcium and faint residual oil, consistent with prolonged contact with human skin. He published nothing about it, but 2 weeks later sent a letter to a colleague describing how the hinge's engraved initials matched an earlier civic mark from Blois' foundry catalogued in 1898, the year preceding Marguerite's disappearance. He wondered if both objects had originated from the same local workshop used for church repairs. That simple observation reconnected the legend to municipal reality, grounding it once more in the documented history of Blois, recorded by the Bibliothèque Abbé Grégoire, where every civic account, flood, and restoration was stored like sediment. While Bourdet's rational approach dismissed any notion of haunting, he admitted privately that during his inspection he felt an intermittent vibration in the metal, faint as breath. He considered it a trick of nerves, yet kept the key on his desk for several nights before returning it. The curator later found a small violet petal pressed inside its envelope, its origin unrecorded. By 1956, the building that had once housed Marguerite's lodgings was finally torn down, replaced by a warehouse. No ceremony marked the demolition, but one worker recounted that as they broke the final wall, a current of cold air escaped, carrying a floral scent none could name. The men laughed, saying, "The teacher takes her last attendance." Afterward, the new facade gleamed smooth and unremarkable, but the ground beneath remained damp for months despite the summer heat. Visitors still asked locals about the vanished woman. Most shrugged, saying, "She's part of our weather now." And indeed the river's mist seemed heavier near the bridge at dawn, curling like breath around the stones, while pigeons perched silent on the church roof. The city changed, but the rhythm of footsteps along Rue du Pont-Neuf still echoed, as if the cobbles remembered who once passed there and who never came back. By the 1960s, Blois had wrapped its unease in routine. The east wall of Saint-Nicolas was simply part of the scenery, photographed for postcards that mentioned nothing of lavender or keys. A new generation regarded the legend as an old provincial ghost story told to amuse visitors. The museum artifacts were moved again during renovation, catalogued under objects of unknown context, Loire region, and the records of Marguerite Lefevre's case remained sealed in a brittle folder few bothered to open. Among those who did was historian Jean Lenoir, a descendant of the parish priest who first wrote, "She went out and did not return." Jean's essay on forgotten investigations of Blois cited her ancestors' meticulous notes and compared them to the later recollections of Commissaire Duret. She mentioned Blois itself, the city's architectural and psychological geography, echoing that article still preserved in the Wikipedia archives, describing how places retain memory like scent upon fabric. Lenoir's study concluded without speculation, only a warning. Some absences survive by structure alone. Remove the walls, and you remove the record. When the essay was printed in 1967, a copy was sent to the parish office. The current priest, curious, ordered minor cleaning of the east wall before repainting for the first time in 3 decades. The workers stripped the old plaster layer and found beneath it another, darker and smooth as wax, sealed generations earlier. The surface gave off a faint fragrance when exposed to air, neither damp nor decay, but something floral, faded, almost polite. A mason pressed his ear to it and swore he heard nothing, yet stepped back quickly, insisting the stone had shifted against his palm. They repainted without further comment, leaving the base untouched where the discoloration persisted. By then, only archivists and older residents remembered the name Lefevre and Evu, and they spoke softly, as if sound might wake something. Each spring, when the first mist rose off the Loire, a few early risers, walking near Rue du Pont Neuf, reported the same small detail: a single violet lying on the stones, edges dry, scent intact. No one ever saw who placed it there. The church bells would ring, pigeons scatter, and the river breathe its fog across the embankment, drawing the boundary once more between what the city recalls and what it prefers not to name. Blois endures, its streets restored, its archives orderly, its mysteries folded into civic memory. Yet those who stand before the east wall in the first light of morning sometimes feel the faint warmth of the stone, as if the breath beneath has never quite left, only learned to wait.